sometimes wonder, leaving that cup up there, especially after someone mentioned that someday I'm going to put something in it. And when you come back to it, but anyway, not tonight. It's just water. Thankful for that. Sometimes I wrestle with, what do you say on a Sunday night to a group of people that are obviously focused on the life of Jesus very strongly? And not to say that some that aren't able to make it back on Sunday night are not strong Christians. But this group is, amongst others too. And what do? I mean, do you ask for more? No, I don't think so. Do you look to say, well, just hang in there? Yeah, sometimes. Because we all need that encouragement to remind ourselves that as life gets difficult, we have to hang in there. But sometimes I find that the best of what I gain out of it, and therefore kind of conclude maybe that's a little bit general for everybody, is to look at the life of individuals. So that's what I'd like to do tonight. And this character comes from the 37th chapter of the book of the Bible. That's obviously the first book of the Bible, because there's more than 30 in Genesis. But Genesis chapter 37 is where this character's story begins. He's the most loved person in the Bible. We'll see here in just a second. And the most hated person in the Bible. And also God talks a lot about him, because he talks from chapter 37 all the way through to chapter 50, very particularly about some of the things that happened to him, some of the things that he did, and except for one chapter within that section, most of it is about his life. And his name is Joseph. He has another name that the Pharaoh will name him in the process of time. You probably don't remember it, but you might remember that he was given a name. And it's a hyphenated name. It's not like Zaphanaphat, or however you would say it is enough, but it's that and then one more on top of that. But Joseph is such a common name that we still use the name to name children today. And that was thousands of years ago. Isn't that interesting? I find so. But as we look at what's going on here, and starting in chapter 37, I want to read just the first few verses here. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, it's really about Joseph. It says the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad, because he was the youngest, or the second youngest anyway, the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah and his father's wives. And there's a mixture of brothers in that thing because of a couple different wives and wives maids. So his brothers, for the most part, except for one, are all half-brothers. And then it says the last part of verse 2, and Joseph brought a bad report, of them to his father. Not a good way to get along with brothers. Just go home and tell Dad about what's going on, and that doesn't make you look good. Not a good start for Joseph, but he's telling him probably, his father Jacob, what actually is taking place. Now verse 3 gives us a little indication of what we talked about here. Now Israel, that's the same name as Jacob. He's got double name here. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, also of his favorite wife, I might say also, and had made him a tunic of many colors. Colorful tunics, I don't think were a big thing back then, a very prominent thing. It probably was kind of like the Model A back when it first came out. You could get it in every color as long as it was black. The tunics were probably brown and black. If they didn't start out totally that way, probably have to be worn for a long enough time, they were. So this is unique. Very unique in the fact that his dad was not only targeting him as somebody special, but really indulging him way beyond that, and the fact that this young guy is bold enough to wear this thing. In most settings, we don't find too many men wearing coats of many colors. You might find on a given occasion maybe something unusual or bright, but not a variety of different colors. Back then I would think it would even be less. And yet his dad does something to highlight him, and he wears it. He had the boldness to wear it. His dad loved him a lot, and was not embarrassed in front of all the other brothers to demonstrate, you're the favorite. Now, I don't know, parents or kids for that matter, if in your home there are favorites among the siblings or not. But a lot of times there's sibling rivalry because we feel like there might be. Years ago when I was growing up, there was a couple guys called the Smothers Brothers, and a lot of their comic routine was over, Mom always liked you best. And that's the way some people always feel. Matter of fact, a lot of people feel that way, and even in a variety of different settings where they'll squabble back and forth over who's right about that. But nonetheless, there was a clear difference here about how much Joseph was loved by his father. Now, when we get to verse 4, here's where the difficulty comes in. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him. They hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Now remember, he's 17 at this time. I don't know at what age he actually got the coat, but it was prevalent, or at least evident rather, that way before this time, Dad loved Joseph better. And then when he got the coat, I mean, just imagine a family photo if you had them back then. You know, here's everybody wearing brown except for Joseph. It was obvious. And whenever you went anywhere, and they always did, brothers went here or there, whatever, you know, it's just kind of like, whoa, who gave you that bright coat? You know, among all him, it's just, everybody around knew. It was obvious to everybody, this guy was special, for Dad anyway. Which just made it worse for him, and his brothers couldn't stand him. The Bible uses the word hated him. Now, going along a little further, they really hated him, as you read the next verse. Now, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Now, his dream will involve the fact that he's going to be over them. They don't want to hear that because he already, even though he's the younger brother, he's already the favorite. He doesn't want to be another favorite in another way. So he said to them, Joseph, don't rub it in, but he does, please hear this dream, which I have dreamed. This is not how to win friends and influence people. I mean, if they don't like what you're dreaming, then stop telling the dream to them. But that's not what Joseph's doing. And much along the way here, all I can do is say, God is up to something. Whether Joseph totally understands everything that's going on in this, I don't know. But he does, and he says he's going to tell them the dream, and his brothers don't want to hear it. But verse 7 says, now, they were binding sheaves, this is his dream, in the field. Then behold, my sheep arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheep. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? And then he adds again, they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So here you've got a situation that's obviously developing, and we read this story, we know it's because of what God is up to, but in the whole process, as they're living through that, they're not seeing it that way at all. Not his brothers. Maybe Joseph has a glimpse of it because he's getting the dreams, but they don't want to hear about it, so they hate him. So he talks to them. Well, they hate him even more because of that. And then the dreams even reveal more, and so they can't stand the guy. And you know the story more than I do, or at least as much as I do, and having read this before, but it's interesting how this all kind of develops, because people just don't do things like this as much today in families. But nonetheless, this is what's going on. So they hated him even more. Now remember, back in verse 2 that Joseph is 17 years old. And so this has been going on for a while. The favoritism. Now when the dreams come in, wherever they come in, or maybe it comes in his 17th year, by this time they're already decided they don't like him. They don't want to hear anything more. And he's already got the best coat, the best everything. If it had been something today, he would be having a sports car and everything else when nobody else got anything. This is what Joseph is getting. Okay. Now things shift. He gets sold into slavery. And basically, it's a reprieve for him. Look at verse 18. Now his brothers are some distance off. And as they see him coming up, this is what happens. Now when they were far off, and even though he had come near them, they conspired against him to kill him. So that's in their mind, at least in most of them. So they said to one another, look, this dreamer's coming. Well, it's pretty easy to pick him out. I mean, he's like a glowing spot. Whether, he's 600 yards away, there's this bright colored blob coming down the hill. It's Joseph, because it's the color that you don't want to see. He's got that same thing on. He's always got it on. And it just says, Dad likes me more. So they see him coming a long distance off. And they start plotting. And as they plot to kill him, they're talking about, how they're going to fake this to Dad, about a wild beast devouring him, etc. Now, an older brother named Reuben intercedes, at least in his mind here. Verse 21, it says, now when Reuben heard it, he wanted, or at least delivered them out of their hands. And he said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but let's cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand at him, that he might not deliver them out of their hands and bring them back to his father. And so Reuben's got in mind, we're going to talk about this because they're up to something, and later on I'm going to sneak back and get him out of the pit myself. But verse 23, it says, now when it came to pass that Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors, of course that's the only one he has, that was on him. And they took him and they cast him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, it had no water in it. And they sat down to eat at the meal. And when they lifted up their eyes and looked, there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry that down to Egypt. So Judah, this is another of the brothers, said to his brothers, there's no profit in it if we kill him and conceal his blood. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. And let not our hands be ones upon him, for he is our brother. Isn't that funny how you can kind of negotiate things in your mind? He is our brother in our flesh, and his brothers listen. Of course, they make a little money out of it. They don't have to do anything and kind of escape the guilt. Verse 28, then the Midianite traders passed by, and so the brothers pulled Joseph out, lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph down to Egypt. His fate is so unique among his brothers. Now, when you were reading through this the first time, and I don't know how many times I read through this before it dawned on me what Joseph might have been thinking, but he never knew any different. That after he found out that he wasn't going to be killed, and he got sold, that he was thinking in his mind, of course, he did have the coat of many colors, so he is the favored son. Dad is going to get them. When they go back home, Dad will know, because I've already told Dad how they behave anyway. And Dad kind of knows. They're the older brothers, they're the mean brats of the group, and several of them are grown men. I mean, Joseph's 17, he's the youngest guy, so we've got guys in their 20s and 30s. And so here's the whole thing. As Joseph is thinking about what's happening here, in his mind he's thinking, when they show back up, and I'm not there, that Dad's going to say, you go find him. And they will not stop looking for me because I know my dad. Now Joseph gets sold off into Egypt, I would say, with this in mind. Dad's going to come looking for me. He's not going to just say, oh, how about that? Joseph's not here. Well, let's go eat, and forget it. So Joseph spends some time down in Egypt. And he spends more time and more time. And Dad never comes looking. Now, the Bible doesn't reveal any of this at all. It starts telling us what goes on in Egypt in the whole process. But while all this is happening, you've kind of got in your mind, or at least I do in the back of my mind, that Joseph's thinking, Dad's going to show up one of these days. And he's going to say, hey, have you seen such and such, And they go, oh yeah, he's over here. He was sold into slavery, And Joseph's just waiting for the moment to be put back together with his family, at least with his dad. And nothing ever happens. Now here's where, when I first discovered this, at least in my mind, that Joseph never knew this, and I thought, how devastated Joseph must have been. Because he has gone from being the favorite to the point that nobody cares anymore. Dad's not even looking for me. Now, in all that's happening here, I guess we ought to add one little section here. I've talked about the most loved person, the most hated person. It's the same person. And then there's the biggest lie that was never told. Because once the brothers sell him off into slavery, they got to go back and explain, we haven't seen Joseph. Or where is Joseph? And you know the story if you've read it, that they get his robe and they kill a lamb and they soak it in blood and they come bringing it back before Dad. But here's what happens in this whole thing. Let's look at verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic, they killed a kid of the goats, and they dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father. And he said, and they said then, we have found this. Do you know whether this is your son's tunic or not? Well, duh. I mean, there's none like it anywhere, obviously. But they're not knowing it. Oh, does this kind of look like you? Grown men, let's not try to fake it. But they were. Now, they've not said a word. All they've done is just presented the tunic. In verse 33 it says, and he recognized it, that is Jacob now. And he said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for many days for his son. And all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted, and he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. And thus said his father as he wept for him. They never said a word. They didn't say, we found it on the side of the road. Well, I guess that they presented that part, but they didn't say anything about it. It's just, hey, Dad, this kind of looks familiar. Never said a word, but it was one of the biggest lies never told. We could pause right here and talk about lies sometimes, in the aspect of the fact that sometimes you can imply things and communicate a lie without really saying a word. It doesn't make you less guilty for having done it. They were obviously guilty in what they were doing in misleading that. But in this whole process, what's going on? God is still working in this whole process. The whole story is Joseph's life begins to unfold. Now, there's a matter of God in the picture here too. Let's jump over to chapter 39. Joseph gets sold into Egypt. He's bought by a fellow named Potiphar. And verses 1 through 6 in chapter 39, we see a little bit of what's happening here. And I have to ask myself the question, and I've never really resolved it for the many times that I've read through this story. I can't decide, did he or didn't he? But it says that Joseph was taken down into Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard of the Egyptians, brought him to the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And then verse 2 says this, then the Lord was with Joseph, and he was successful, a successful man, and he was in the house of the masters over the house of the master of Egypt. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had made him all that he'd done to prosper in his hands. And so Joseph found favor in his sight, and served him. And then he made him overseer of the house and all that he put under his authority. And so it was from the time that he had made him overseer of the house and all that was in it, all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So the Lord made everything successful. I know we're seeing that. We're seeing God saying that happened. My question, I guess, as I'm reading through this and reread this is this in Joseph's mind that, well, God is still taking care of me? I know all these things are bad, but this is. And so I wrestle with, what is Joseph really thinking? Other than he's probably thinking Dad's going to show up someday, and he never does. But is God taking care of him? Is he thinking that? We see that. God's telling us that. But is Joseph thinking that that's happening? And I don't know for sure. That's something to chew on. Well, that happens once again in the process of time in Joseph's life, because he goes through another situation and then says, but God was with him. And again, the whole question comes back to mind. Well, as we move on down here in chapter 41, verses 50 and 52, Joseph begins to have a family. He's growing older now and has a couple children. Interesting thing is what's mentioned here. Genesis 41, verses 50 and 52. Now to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, a priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh. That's a term I remember hearing as far as naming a locality here in the United States. And then it says, quotes, as if